And I talked to one of the Indian fighters in New Mexico, and I asked him why he liked to do it. He liked the camaraderie, and he liked to travel. And in the winter he'd go back, and he had a family at the Pueblo, and he'd spend the winter at the Pueblo. But he enjoyed the places he got to go in the summer.
Had never thought about that as a travel opportunity. But of course, your cruise up there in Thunder Mountain, which I assume, even though it's imaginary, was what, basically just over the New Mexican border?
Right.
Kind of around
somewhere
Durango.
around Durango.
Yeah, I thought it might be. So it made perfectly good sense that the Duke City group was up there in Colorado.
And they'll do that. And of course, one of the problems with the Glenwood Springs fire is that and it's becoming more of a problem with all the fires, is that they'll fly the crew in. That crew was from Prineville, Oregon. And so the conditions in a northwest fire are very different from the conditions in a southwest fire, and sometimes they're not aware of that. Or they'll fly them in, and in the old days they used to hike up so they'd get some feel for the terrain and the vegetation and so forth. They'd hike into the fire. But now they'll just drop them right in with helicopters, and they have no time to acclimate themselves to the different conditions. And that was one of the problems in Glenwood Springs, is the firefighters were not aware of some of the dangers of that particular vegetation there.
So when hotshots start, the actual impetus of it is death, but it turns out that it is death in the line of duty, so to speak, and the consequence is a projected civil suit that the parents of the girl are concerned that there was negligence, that the Forest Service hadn't done all that it could do to protect the hotshots, and they wanted to pursue it not particularly for money, but because they were, and I don't know that vengeance is right, but they just felt that there was a wrong there and their daughter had died unnecessarily.
I think, and actually in the Glenwood Springs fire, some of the parents contemplated a suit. I don't know if anybody actually did sue, but I think a lot of the impetus was they just wanted the government to admit they were wrong. I mean, there was a strong feeling that the government was blaming the firefighters for what happened.
Right.
And that really was very upsetting to the families. And it seemed really important to them to prove that their sons and daughters were not to blame for what happened. And I think that's the mother's motivation here, because they all received a settlement, and so the money wasn't the issue.
No, it wasn't the issue. And you know, although this is a murder mystery, really the initial deaths were certainly not murders, but were deaths by people fighting fires. And then eventually, of course, you do bring in...
I have to bring in a murder.
You have to, well...
I have to kill somebody else.
There are just a few murder mysteries that do, or not murder mysteries, pardon me, there are a few mysteries that do not revolve around
Are there?
murders.
I've always wondered if it were possible to do that.
Josephine Tay's The Franchise Affair is about the murder of her reputation. It's one of my all-time favorite books, and it's always up at the top of the British Crime Writer Association all-time favorite list, because it is one of the few that is so successful as a non-murder. Dorothy Sayers' Gaudy Night. There is no murder.
Well, it'd be fun to try that. I don't know if my editor would let me get away with it or not.
Well, it's not very popular in today's mystery scene, and I think I've talked to a lot of editors about it, and I think they think that murder being the ultimate crime, it raises the stakes and heightens the suspense, and that's what most people expect when they open a mystery. But you really, if you envision it, could write a book about arson or embezzlement, or in the case of The Franchise Affair, slander, and make it suspenseful and exciting without actually having a death. Some of the women in Jeopardy books don't necessarily have a death. You know, they can have the kidnapping of a child, and the impetus is to retrieve. The suspense comes from attempting to retrieve the child rather than the death of the child. So that's sort of a subcategory of mystery. But it gets, and romantic suspense oftentimes. Those old Mary Stuart books that, revealing my age, that I grew up on, which I absolutely love, didn't always have a mystery. Sometimes it was treasure. In fact, even those Guy kind of books, you know, where well, like The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, or those kinds of things, where it was much more of a con, and there was treasure involved, and all didn't have to have.
You know what's starting to interest me after writing 7 books with a sleuth, to write some from the point of view of the criminal.
That's a great idea. The wrong end of the gun.
I'm thinking of Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books, and how he does something really terrible, but at the same time you get involved with him and are kind of rooting for him to get away. I think it'd be kind of interesting to do something like that, like Evil Women, some kind of Evil Women books.
It would be.
But then I was telling someone about the series, and they said, well, what are you going to do, put her in jail and write from jail? And I said, well, no, really, I don't think I could do that. But I don't know if it could be a series, but maybe a series in spirit rather than a series of a continuing character.
Well, there are a few that have. Thomas Perry's Butcher's Boy was a guy like that, and then he did write a sequel to it, the name of which has presently escaped me, but he did bring back a character like that. And even stuff like the Fiddler series, your own publisher, HarperCollins, publishes the Maxwell's Fiddler books. Fiddler is one of those sleuths who's really a paladin, you know, a knight of old in modern dress, and he achieves justice outside the system, and occasionally it involves himself actually rubbing out a bad guy or doing something like that. So you can certainly have a sympathetic character who in himself can be a criminal. It would be, well, remember The Sting, the movie? How involved everybody was. I always try to use that to explain what a caper is when people say, well, what kind of a mystery is a caper?
No, that's definitely a caper.
It definitely is. It's kind of a classic caper, and the fun comes to see if the bad guys outwit, you know, other bad guys.
I think we all have larceny in us, and there are all the things that we would like to do, but we check ourselves from doing, and I kind of write a book where the person doesn't check herself.
Well,
she just goes ahead and does this sort of thing.
After 7 books about Neil, I would think it would be interesting to, you know, to try your hand at something else. How sympathetic do you think your publishers would be with your, because after all, the ultimate product is that you need to sell the book.
I know, I don't know. I had a long talk with my agent about it, and he kept harping back to the point that you have to make the main character sympathetic. And I'm not sure if that's, sympathy is really the issue or understanding. Because I can think back to maybe there are characters that I didn't like so much, but I could empathize with them, or they'd go through something and I'd say, oh yeah, I've been there, I felt that, I understand that. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, you don't want someone that everybody's going to hate. There's a fine line there.
That's very true. And speaking of Neil, because we haven't really talked about her so much, you've used her as the protagonist in all 7 of your books. She is an attorney, an Albuquerque attorney, and she really isn't a criminal attorney. She is a civil. I mean, most of her practice is not criminal matters, and she seems to get dragged into murder mysteries kind of by accident more than by any design.
I have to keep bringing that in.
Well, and I think that does make them interesting. Now, do you not have some personal background, not as an attorney, but as a paralegal?
Well, also I was in the real estate business for a while, so I spent a lot of time dealing with attorneys. And I temped for law firms. When I was writing the first book, I felt I need to know more about lawyers and the law. Plus, I needed a job, so...
You needed to eat while you were writing?
Yes, that too. I wasn't making any money on my short stories and poetry. So I temped for a law firm, a large law firm in Boston. And they had covered every area of the law. I worked for all different kinds of lawyers, and I just pumped them. And they were very helpful to me, up until the time I got published. And after that...
Oh, really? That dried it out?
That dried it out. But fortunately, I didn't have to do it anymore, so it worked out okay. But see, many lawyers, and I've discovered this is true of lawyers and professional people, doctors, they have a secret desire to be writers. I think it's because the kind of work they do is so stressful and demanding, and also they're sort of intellectually oriented that they love to stay home and shut the door and just write. And I have to deal with clients and patients. It's sort of a fantasy that a lot of them have.
I can certainly understand that. I'll tell you that, you know, for me personally, it's a lot less confrontational to have a bookstore than being a law office. Absolutely.
Yeah, and, you know, those kind of occupations are very stressful. Not that writing, I guess, is, but in a different way.
Well, don't you think also it's because they have great stories to tell and they like someone to hear them?
Oh, yeah.
See, I've always thought that's why cops oftentimes in retirement, I mean, I can't tell you how many policemen I know that have put in their 20 years and then they start writing. Think about how many.
They do. They have wonderful stories.
And yeah, I mean, they've just got years, an accumulation of great things to say, and it seems a shame not to bring it out in some fashion. Paul Bishop, I find, is real interesting that way. He had a chance to retire after 20 years with the LAPD, and he's signed on for another 5 just to kind of keep the stories rolling, but at the same time, he signed an extensive double book contract. And you can just see him interfacing right now between the wind-up of his professional police career and his burgeoning author career. He's going to just segue right in from one to the other.
Well, I had a conversation with Earl Emerson about this, and he was asking me what I thought, whether he should, because he's a firefighter, an urban firefighter in Seattle, and he has two series, one of which involves a firefighter. And he's kind of thinking of retiring. I said, oh, Earl, you know, you're giving up a lot of great material.
That's true, but he took a tremendous amount of heat, pardon the pun, when he wrote that 3rd firefighting mystery about, if not corruption, about difficulties within the fire department, and he thought maybe he'd gone that step too far, you know, or they maybe were just as soon drumming him out.
That would be a problem too, actually, because you would have to be careful about what you say.
Well, I think so. I think
kind of
that's
a
why
job.
most of them are actually retired professional people,